I feel it's a bit of a short straw to follow Kiri Tunks, to be frank. Thank you to Labour Women's Declaration for inviting me to speak tonight. As has just been said, I've spent most of the last 4 years working for Jeremy as head of domestic policy and the leader of the opposition's office, a position I resigned in January. The day after I joined to work in Lotto, half the shadow cabinet resigned, and it would be an understatement to say that those early days were chaotic. It's not betraying a state secret to suggest that the manifesto we produced in 2017 for the surprise general election was prepared in a little bit of a rush by colleagues completely unprepared for the task. It was a colleague of mine who prepared the section on women inequalities, along with Sarah Champion, who was at that stage our spokesperson in the shadow cabinet. And it's very clear on reading the 2017 manifesto that they drew very heavily, word for word almost, on what was then the recently published Women and Equality Select Committee report on transgender discrimination, with its recommendations for self-ID and other best practices. Our internal opponents at that time within the party decided to provide us with enough rope with which to hang ourselves, and so, like everything else, those ideas on gender just went through on the nod. After that election, when I and my colleagues were surprised to keep our jobs, I set about looking, as the manifesto of 2017 required, for the impact of those policies on women in all of the areas for which I held lead advisory responsibility. Amongst those, hospital wards, prisons, intimate care settings, sports. You can probably see where I'm going. There were a lot of others. I kept imagining my sister and my mother in the settings that I was considering. My sister submitting to a cervical cancer smear test performed by somebody who had employment rights, but who also had stubble. My mother, a ward sister for her career, managing the women's ward with someone who had the human right to be respected at work, but was also a resident exhibitionist. So I went to my boss and I talked to Jeremy, and I secured some authorizations to progress work in order to try and resolve some of the conflicts of rights that were arising. And if doing that was transphobic hatred, then expel me. As I explored those issues, we had a discussion within the party that you might recall about all-women shortlists. And I let it be known that I had some concerns. And suddenly, from that point, doors started closing. Stonewall refused to meet me again. LGBT Labour gave me the cold shoulder at conferences. Dawn Butler wouldn't take my calls or answer my emails. I do think I've got my own back. But it was the founders of Women's Place UK who did agree to meet me for discussions. And I am honoured to stand in solidarity with those decent women. That's been the pattern ever since. Almost all of those who are advocating for gender identity interests have consistently refused to address or discuss the issues for which we were seeking practical resolutions. And those practical resolutions became critical for me personally. I'd started to look at the clinical protocols for gender non-conforming youth, and I was concerned by the explosion of referrals to gender identity clinics, especially of young girls. I found a trail of concerted, intense lobbying, harassment of medical staff, reactionary gender stereotypes, a woeful lack of evidence, and increasingly, the voices of detransitioners. The misdiagnosis of young people struggling with an acceptance of their own orientation was clear. The clinical pathways of affirmative care were untested. They were fraught with unassessed risks. They were shrouded in comorbidities and in the fog of social pressures experienced by all adolescents at puberty. And they seemed to be a one-way street. There was another narrative explanation, but it wasn't one that Stonewall was interested in or seemed concerned about. It seemed to me that young lesbians were becoming collateral damage in the battle for transgender acceptance. And that is why, Bev, we need an LGBT rights campaign, and why I will also stand proudly with the LGBT Alliance. Because Stonewall isn't doing its job. Back in the 1980s, when Stonewall arrived on the scene, we campaigned for our rights in very different ways. I joined the Labour Party around the time of the miners' strike, 35 years ago, when lesbians and gay support the miners drew me in, and they educated me. We didn't know platform, unquestionably homophobic striking miners. We offered them our solidarity. And if could speak for hours about that. But if you haven't seen the film Pride, please do. And even better, look out Dancing in July, the original documentary, which is available on Vimeo. We asked back then for rights which did not impinge on the rights of others. I had been a campaign activist for around 5 years when Clause 28 was tabled, and I was among 20 or 30 people that met that night in Islington Town Hall. Linda Bellos, incidentally, was there with us. I offered to provide and open the campaign office, provide a room, a desk, a phone line, a typewriter, all of which I did the next day. A week later, after we'd got a little bit of coverage in the Nationals, we received our first cheque. It paid for the police deposit for our first protest, march and rally for Stop the Clause. And it came from a South Wales National Union of Mine Workers branch. It was the very first money we got, and all they wrote was, "In solidarity." I know, I want to tear up. Opening that letter was a highlight of my life. That's the opportunity that has been missed by conducting the campaign for trans rights in the way it is being conducted. The chance of strengthening progressive forces has been squandered, pitting one oppressed group against another, shouting down concerns as prejudice bigotry. Well, if our records are prejudice bigotry, you know what to do. Expel us. Yeah. Today's campaigns are not only conducted in secret groups behind closed doors, they're dishonest. And I will end here with an illustrative example. Back in that chaotic manifesto of 2017, we included a commitment to age-appropriate sex education, and it's worth reading exactly what it said. We will make age-appropriate sex and relationship education a compulsory part of the curriculum so that young people can learn about respectful relationships. So young people can learn about respectful relationship. And just to underline it, it was in the section of the manifesto on violence against women and girls. Our policy was to empower young people, especially young girls, to help them to identify inappropriate behaviour from an early age. And what have LGBT Labour done with this policy commitment? They've turned it into an affirmative gender identity programme. They've produced a toolkit that doesn't empower lesbian and gay youth. It doesn't mention them. It's all about recognising and affirming transgender identities among school children. You can check it. It's on their website. And it suits their purposes to define us by our extremes of association. But it suits our purpose to expose their harmful agenda. So, Labour, if you want to take your cues from those who seek to undermine our policies, to depart from our procedures, from those who are anti-democratic, who pursue an individualistic philosophy in place of collective action, go ahead, expel me, because I'm standing in solidarity with WP UK and with the LGBT Alliance.